Jeremy Clarkson grew nothing on 200 acres of some of the finest farmland in England this year. On purpose. Not a poor yield. Not a failed gamble on weather. Nothing put in the ground at all. A man sitting on a net worth of £60 million ought to be able to stomach losing money on a crop of wheat. But he can't. Nobody in Britain can. Right now. He ran the numbers himself, and the answer came back the same every time. Growing food on that land guaranteed a loss. His own words. Not a journalist reaching for a dramatic headline. So if the most famous farm on the planet can't make food production pay, with a TV deal and a global audience backing it, what's left for the family operations with no camera crew and no fallback? By the time we're done here, you'll understand exactly why Britain's loudest voice went quiet across 200 acres of Oxfordshire, and why that quiet might be the most honest thing he's ever put on paper. Picture it, late summer 2026, out on that golden gray stretch of Chipping Norton hillside, and 200 acres of diddly squat doing precisely nothing. No winter wheat catching the early light, no barley heads nodding in the wind. Just bare resting earth and a man in a wax jacket standing at its edge, looking less like a farmer surveying his land and more like a general staring across the site of a battle he'd already decided not to fight. This wasn't carelessness. Anyone who's spent time across 5 series watching Clarkson blunder, swear loudly, occasionally succeed, and then blunder again, knows he doesn't leave things undone by accident. This was a spreadsheet decision. Cold, deliberate, the kind of exit call a commodities trader makes when the fundamentals have turned against the position. Writing in his column in The Sun, he said it with a bluntness that arable farmers have felt in their bones for years, but rarely heard stated so plainly by someone the whole country reads on a Sunday morning. It is, he wrote, quite simply impossible to make money growing food. Not hard, not marginal, impossible. Then he delivered the number that made farmers across Norfolk, Yorkshire, and the Welsh borders put their mugs down. 200 acres on the farm. Nothing planted. Not rewilded. Not sold for development. Not enrolled in any scheme. Just taken out of production because the guaranteed outcome of sowing anything on it was a loss. Not a risk. A certainty. Sit with what that actually means. This is a man who has spent the better part of 7 years buying seed, ordering fertilizer, wrestling with machinery, hiring contractors, and operating on the fundamental belief that if you put wheat into English soil in autumn, something worth more than the input costs comes out the following summer. That is the whole operating premise of arable farming. It's the arrangement this country has run on since the great enclosures of the 18th century, when common land was parceled up and English agriculture became the engine that fed an industrializing nation. And in 2026, on the most photographed farm in Britain, that premise has broken down. There's a very particular English understatement in the way Clarkson delivers this. No theatrical fury for once. No eruptions directed at a planning inspector or a council committee. Just a kind of exhausted honesty. The tone you'd use to mention the boiler's packed up, or the Land Rover needs replacing for the 3rd time. Except this isn't the boiler. This is 200 acres of some of the best arable land in the country, sitting idle on purpose, because the economics of food production have inverted so completely that doing nothing beats doing something. If you're tempted to file this under rich man's eccentricity, you'd be wrong. The numbers behind that empty field are the same numbers sitting on the desk of every arable farmer in Britain this morning. Clarkson just happens to be the one with enough of a platform to say it out loud where the whole country can hear it. To understand how a 1,000-acre estate ends up leaving a fifth of itself bare, you need to follow what has happened to the financial architecture of English farming over the past decade. This didn't arrive without warning. For years, British farmers operated inside a financial buffer that most of them never had to think too hard about. The EU's Common Agricultural Policy, delivered domestically through the Basic Payment Scheme. The BPS was not a fortune. It was not glamorous money, but it was reliable money, paid per hectare, and it did exactly what it was designed to do. It smoothed out the brutal years when input costs spiked or wheat prices fell through the floor, and it kept working farms from going under. You grew the wheat, you sold it at whatever the global market offered, and the BPS check arrived on schedule to make the numbers add up. It was the threadbare but familiar coat that got a generation of farmers through one more winter. Then Britain left the EU, and with it went the BPS. What arrived in its place was a new framework called environmental land management, paying farmers not for output but for environmental outcomes. Restored hedgerows, improved soil structure, wildlife corridors, floodplain management. The principle was sound. The implementation, to put it generously, has been a mess. The Agricultural Transition Plan set out a glide path from 2021 to 2027, during which BPS payments would taper off progressively while the new ELM schemes ramped up to take their place. In practice, the tapering happened. The replacement didn't. The Sustainable Farming Incentive, the main ELM scheme most farmers could access, was abruptly closed in March 2025, just as tens of thousands of farmers had structured their business plans around it. The BPS, meanwhile, had already been cut by 76% in a single stroke in 2025, leaving the 80% of the 82,000 farmers who received £30,000 or less from it suddenly operating with a fraction of the financial cushion they'd planned around. The new SFI replacement scheme wasn't expected to open until April 2026 at the earliest. Some farmers waited years for the replacement safety net, while the old one was already gone from under them. Industry consultants at Anderson's called it plainly, the gap between what was wound down and what was stood up has been where British farming has been quietly bleeding out. Not dramatically, not with headlines. Just quietly, farm by farm, field by field. Now add the actual cost of growing anything. Ammonium nitrate, the nitrogen fertilizer that underpins most English arable farming, was sitting around £406 per tonne in late 2025, roughly 25% higher than the year before, driven by European gas prices and tightening supply chains from the Middle East. Granular urea was pushing £424 per tonne. Gas accounts for around 60% of the manufacturing cost of nitrogen fertilizer, which means every time European gas markets move, the fertilizer bill for every arable farmer in Britain moves with it. Then there's red diesel, the agricultural staple that powers everything from the combine harvester to the grain dryer, which climbed to around 123.7 pence per litre by April 2026. Up sharply from a 2025 average of around 69p splash hals, the kind of move that adds hundreds of thousands of pounds to operating costs across a large estate over a full season. At the end of all of that, the fertilizer, the diesel, the seed, the chemical applications, the labor, the machinery servicing, the fixed costs, a British wheat farmer in 2026 is looking at a cost of production estimated at around £210 per tonne, against a futures price sitting in the range of £160 to £168 per tonne. That's not a thin margin, that's negative territory before the grain even leaves the field. And here's what makes it particularly brutal. That wheat price isn't set by how well the crop grew, how hard anyone worked, or what it cost to produce. It's set by a global commodity market that updates overnight in Chicago and Paris based on harvest forecasts in Argentina, Australia, and Canada. A bumper wheat season on the other side of the world doesn't care how much ammonium nitrate cost in Oxfordshire. Clarkson has lived through every line of this in front of a camera. The TB outbreak that locked down his cattle operation and left him unable to buy or sell cows for 2 months. Heat waves in 2025 that scorched crops he'd spent a fortune establishing. An oats harvest he described as turning the color of a hearing aid. Series after series of Clarkson's farm has functioned, perhaps unintentionally, as the most expensive and most watched educational film on the economics of English arable farming ever produced, narrated by a man who genuinely didn't need the money and went into it anyway. Which is precisely why so many actual farmers, the ones with no Amazon deal and no TV income to fall back on, have found something close to solidarity in watching him hit the same walls they've been running into quietly for years. Except nobody was there to film theirs. 2025 was, by Clarkson's own account, the worst year he'd experienced since buying Diddley Squat. A shocking harvest wrecked by heat and drought, the TB lockdown, the sense that every variable had moved against him simultaneously. When the most famous farm in Britain, run by someone with no shortage of capital to absorb bad years, calls 2025 its worst season on record, you're not looking at a run of bad luck. You're looking at structural conditions that have made farming close to impossible, regardless of how much money you can throw at the problem. What makes 2026's empty acres land differently from everything that came before is the timeline. Clarkson didn't arrive at this moment by accident. Back in 2023, writing his Sunday column, he called it his last roll of the dice and warned explicitly that the subsidy income he'd been relying on to offset the gap between what growing food cost and what the market paid for it was drying up, and that continuing to grow crops under the conditions he could see coming would simply lose money. That wasn't hyperbole, and it wasn't performance. That was a man reading his own accounts 3 years ahead and not liking the trajectory. The prediction has now arrived, on schedule, exactly as advertised. It's worth noting what a rarity that kind of public honesty about farm economics has been. Most farmers don't talk about their accounts in public. There's a deep cultural reticence in British agriculture about admitting the numbers don't work. Partly pride, partly fear, partly because the banks are still watching. Clarkson, for all the ways in which he's an unlikely champion for the industry, walks into that silence with a £60 million cushion under him and says the thing quietly into his column. That the equation has broken, that leaving the land empty is now the rational outcome. That is a different kind of farming journalism to anything that's come before it. Then came the winter of 2024, and the row over inheritance tax that transformed a generation of mild-mannered English farmers into something that looked, for a few astonishing weeks, like an actual political movement. The October 2024 budget, under the then Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves, announced the removal of the agricultural property relief that had kept working farms exempt from inheritance tax since 1992, when John Major's government introduced it specifically to protect food security and the intergenerational transfer of farming families. The new rules, set to take effect from April 2026, would apply a 20% inheritance tax rate, half the standard rate, to any inherited farm assets valued above £1 million, payable interest-free over 10 years. The farming lobby called it the tractor tax. Farmers said it bluntly: they might be asset-rich on paper, with land and machinery that adds up to millions, but they are cash-poor in practice. The profit margins aren't there to pay an inheritance tax bill. The only way to settle it is to sell the land, which in many cases means the farm ceases to exist as a farm. On 19 November 2024, more than 13,000 people gathered in Parliament Square in London, the biggest rural demonstration this country had seen in decades. Tractors blocked streets near the Houses of Parliament. Banners read, "No farmers, no food, no future." Children rode toy tractors around Westminster. Clarkson was there, and it was in that moment, standing shoulder to shoulder with farmers whose livelihoods genuinely depended on the relief he'd previously used mainly as a tax-efficient way to store his earnings, that something shifted. For years, he'd let it be known, with considerable mischief, that buying diddly squat back in 2008 had been partly a clever arrangement to keep the taxman at bay. Land, he'd written at the time, was better than any bank because the government didn't get any of it when you died. Great story. Very much on brand. But standing in the crowd in Westminster, next to farmers telling him this was the end of their family operations, generations of land, gone to pay a bill that arrived because some accountant valued the topsoil at more than the farm could ever earn from it. The joke stopped being funny. He quietly walked it back, admitted the real reason he'd bought the farm was wanting somewhere decent to shoot pheasants, and that the tax angle just made better copy. That, in its small way, takes a certain amount of honesty to say once the original version has already made its rounds. Nobody voted Clarkson into the role of agriculture's spokesman. He reversed into it one wet harvest and one furious column at a time until the job fit whether he'd chosen it or not. Read his columns in order from 2019 onwards, and you can watch the transformation happen in real time. The cheerful metropolitan buying a farm for a laugh. The mild exasperation of a man who didn't know what a heifer was being told by a planning committee he can't open a shop. The growing fury at a system that seemed designed to make food production unworkable. The genuine solidarity with people he'd never have met in his previous life if an Amazon commissioning editor hadn't come calling. Clarkson didn't confine his 2026 column to describing the problem. He took direct aim at who he holds responsible for making it worse. With Andy Burnham now in Downing Street as Prime Minister, one of the early rural appointments in the new administration was Dame Angela Eagle, given the role of Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the job that decides whether the arithmetic of English farming ever gets fixed. Clarkson, writing with what he called his farming hat firmly on, was not reassured. He didn't soften it. His concern wasn't personal, or at least he'd have you believe that. It was about competence. The specific frustration that has run through everything he's written about British agriculture for years. The sense that the people with the power to change the conditions in which farmers operate have spent very little time standing in those conditions. He noted, with evident relish at his own research, that the new minister's most memorable moment in public life was being told by David Cameron across the dispatch box to calm down, dear. He pointed out she had never worked on a farm, never run a business of any kind. His verdict was that appointing her to oversee the countryside was roughly equivalent to appointing a stand-up comedian to run the army. Pointed, deliberate, designed to produce a headline. But there's a real question buried under the joke, and it's one that's been directed at nearly every DEFRA secretary anyone can remember. Who in Westminster actually knows what a farm's accounts look like at 11 o'clock on a wet November Tuesday when the diesel bill is overdue, the vet's been out twice in a fortnight, and overnight the wheat futures have fallen again? Fair-minded people will disagree here, and disagree hard. There is a perfectly decent argument that British agricultural policy has been captured for too long by landowners and large farming interests, and that someone coming to the brief without inherited assumptions about how it has always been done might be exactly what a broken system needs. There is an equally decent argument that you cannot effectively reform an industry you have never operated inside, no matter how sharp you are on paper. Clarkson has picked his side, loudly and publicly, the way he always does. A joke sharp enough to travel, but with a serious point underneath it that outlives the laugh. What is not in dispute, regardless of which side of that argument you sit on, is the backdrop against which this minister has arrived. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, the new levy on imported fertiliser, was already pushing up costs before its UK implementation from January 2027. Ireland's farmers reported a 35% rise in urea costs following the EU's parallel CBAM enforcement from January 2026. UK nitrogen fertiliser imports collapsed by comparable proportions in the same period, with suppliers struggling to absorb the cost without passing it straight on to the people growing the food. At the same time, the global wheat price sits below what it costs most British farmers to produce the grain. The maths don't need a minister to make them worse. They're already pointing in the wrong direction. What they need is someone who understands them well enough to intervene before they get worse still. Clarkson's prediction, delivered with the grim energy of a man who hopes he's wrong, is that conditions deteriorate further before they improve. Given the track record of his previous predictions, nobody on a working farm is dismissing it this time. If growing wheat on prime English soil has become economically self-defeating even for a man worth £60 million, what does the land turn into instead? The answer unfolding across the English countryside right now is one of the more significant shifts in land use this country has seen in a generation. And it's accelerating faster than most people outside farming circles seem to have registered. Some land goes exactly where Clarkson's 200 acres went this summer, nowhere. Held fallow, waiting for either the economics to change or a better option to present itself. But across the broader industry, farmers running the same arithmetic and arriving at the same negative outcome are making different choices. Solar arrays are spreading across fields that once carried barley and winter wheat, earning a predictable income that doesn't care about rainfall, or whether TB rips through the herd in September, or what the global commodity price happens to be doing in Chicago on a given morning. The landscape recovery element of ELM, the scheme that pays landowners to restore woodland, wetland, and habitat at scale, is turning working arable ground back into something closer to the landscape it was before the plow arrived. Rewilding, once a concept that made conventional farmers roll their eyes, is now a genuine financial option in the context where conventional farming isn't. And then there's diversification. The thing Clarkson stumbled into more or less by accident. The farm shop, the restaurant, the pub he bought in Asthall in July 2024 that he's since called the farmer's dog, has become the actual business model for a growing number of estates. A wedding barn doesn't get taken out by blight. A campsite doesn't need nitrogen fertilizer. A distillery doesn't care what the global wheat price does, because it's already bought the grain and turned it into something the market values at a completely different level. For families trying to hold on to farms that have been in the same hands for generations, the choice is no longer between growing food and growing something else. It's between diversification and a sale. What no one really wants to say in polite company is what this means for the food chain. The soil hasn't gone anywhere. England's arable land is still among the most productive in Europe, deep, well-structured, with a climate that historically suits cereal production. What's disappeared is the financial justification for using it to grow food. The fixed costs remain. The input prices keep rising. The commodity prices stay flat or fall. And the gap between the two is now wide enough that rational, experienced farmers are walking away from the activity the land was designed for and doing something else with it. When enough of them make that call, which they already are, quietly, in field after field from Norfolk to the Welsh borders, the question of where the country's food comes from stops being abstract. Clarkson doesn't pretend to have the answer to that one. His solutions, offered in The Sun with characteristic bluntness, include renting the land to a large global agribusiness to power anaerobic digesters, or installing solar panels, or, delivered with enough deadpan that you can't always tell how serious he is, selling the whole thing to a foreign conglomerate to build a high-intensity piggery. His point, delivered underneath the dark humor, is the same one he's been making since 2023, that the conditions which made British arable farming viable for 2 centuries have changed, and that no one in authority seems to be treating that change with the urgency it demands. He's fond of saying that someone in 1926 would never have believed you if you told them that by 2026, the factories would be gone. His contention is that in another 100 years, the same thing will be said about the farms. Return to where this starts. 200 acres of Oxfordshire hillside, standing empty on a farm that has been filmed, streamed, mythologized, and watched in dozens of countries across 5 series of global television. The easy reading of that empty field is failure. Clarkson finally beaten by the land, the way the planning committees and the wet harvests and the TB couldn't quite manage. But that reading gets it wrong in a fundamental way. He didn't stop farming that land because he gave up. He stopped farming it because he ran the numbers honestly and told the truth about what he found. In print, in a national newspaper with millions of readers, in a way that almost nobody else with his platform would bother to, because the truth in question is deeply inconvenient for every government department that has ever had to pretend the British food system is fundamentally sound. Think about the distance actually covered to arrive here. A man who bought a farm in 2008 for a laugh, and by his own later admission, partly because he wanted decent shooting and the tax story made better reading than the real one. Who couldn't distinguish a heifer from a hedge when the cameras first rolled? Who spent years being shouted at by parish councils, mocked by professional farmers, and rained on by weather that seemed to have taken his presence personally? Who watched a TB test come back positive on one of his cows and described the moment with an honesty that didn't belong to the man who used to race Ferraris on motorways? Who called 2025 his worst year ever and then turned up again in 2026 and left 200 acres empty because the alternative was losing money on purpose? Somewhere inside all of that mess, without quite choosing to, he became the one person with enough reach to say the quiet part out loud and have the whole country hear it. Not as a campaigner, not as a politician, not as an industry spokesman, just as a man who bought a farm for the wrong reasons, discovered he cared about it, and eventually cared enough to stop pretending the numbers added up when they demonstrably didn't. The empty field isn't the end of the story. It's the loudest sentence in it. 1,000-acre estate, a decade of losses, 5 series of television watched from London to Los Angeles, all of it arriving at 200 bare acres, and one line every working farmer in Britain has been thinking quietly for the best part of a decade. Finally said in public by someone the whole country happens to be watching. And here's the part worth sitting with. He didn't have to do any of this. He could have kept growing a bit of wheat at a loss because the loss didn't touch him financially, and kept it a private embarrassment that nobody outside the farm gate ever heard about. He could have leaned on the television romance of it, the mud and the machinery and the comedy disasters, and said nothing about the actual economics. Instead, he put it in the paper. He let 200 empty acres become a story rather than a quiet write-off. He didn't blow up British farming by shouting about it. He blew it up by going silent on 200 acres and letting the silence carry the argument 1,000 speeches couldn't have made. There's something very stubbornly British about the whole thing. A man doesn't fight a broken system by burning it down. He refuses to participate in the part that no longer makes any sense, writes 2 dry lines about it on a Sunday morning, and lets 200 empty acres make the case for him. Whatever your view of Clarkson, and this audience holds opinions that run from devoted to firmly skeptical, and that's as it should be, he's done something worth having here. He's taken a conversation that normally happens in a farmhouse kitchen between people who never make the news and put it on the front page. If someone with his platform hadn't done it, it would still be happening and still going unheard. So, Team Clarkson on this one? Or does a man worth £60 million complaining about farm economics strike you as, if you'll forgive it, a bit rich? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you make of it. Subscribe if you haven't, hit the bell, and we'll see you in the next one. And wherever you are, here's hoping someone's field is doing a bit better than Jeremy's this year. Key references: Diddley Squat Farm, Chipping Norton, Oxfordshire Jeremy Clarkson column, The Sun, Summer 2026. Basic Payment Scheme Phase-Out, 2021 to 2027. Sustainable Farming Incentive Closure, March 2025. UK Farmer Inheritance Tax Protests, November 2024. Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, UK Feed Wheat Futures, 168 Quive, December 2025, 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 December 2025,